Hi, I'm Dave from Soft Shuffle, and this is a usage video, a detailed look about how to use Soft Shuffle and all the options that are there. As well as this video, there is an introduction and overview video which gives a bit more context on Soft Shuffle, and a technical video which is a deep dive into how and why Soft Shuffle works. Now, as well as those videos, there are equivalent pages on softshuffle.co.uk if you prefer to read things. And with that, let's take a look at what's in this video. This video starts off with a demo of Soft Shuffle in use. Now, this is the same demo that is in the introductory video, but it is followed up with some discussion of the principles underlying Soft Shuffle and the options you might choose based on that. And then we go through all of those options and how to set them and how to use them on the shuffler page in the next section. And finally, the rest of the video is taken up by discussion on how and when and why I use Soft Shuffle and when I don't, to give you some insight. So let's get started. Okay, so how do we use Soft Shuffle? Well, the first thing we do is we pick which mat we're going to use, and there's both these 21 pile mats and these smaller 10 pile mats, which we will use for this demonstration. We then get our deck of cards, and we get our phone, and we navigate to softshuffle.co.uk and the shuffler page, and there are these helpful QR codes on each of the mats to take you there. Okay, from there we input our settings and follow the instructions on screen. So we put in the number of cards we're using, the mat configuration we're using, the number of rows of output we want. We then click check settings, check the settings, say we're good, and click randomise deck. Okay, and now we deal them out based on the instructions on screen. So we navigate those using the next and the previous button. So we start to deal out according to the instructions. We then gather in the direction shown on screen. And we deal out again. We then gather in the direction shown on the screen, which is the opposite one. And you're done. Your deck is now fully randomized. Okay, so let's talk a bit through the options we have when we use Soft Shuffle, and we'll start with a bit of terminology as a recap. So obviously we have the number of cards that you're using, which is just the number of cards you're using. Then we have the number of piles or mat spaces. So generally when I'm talking about this, what I mean when I say piles is the actual piles of cards you're dealing, and mat spaces is the number of possible mat spaces you could use. And then we have the number of passes, which is the number of times you deal a card out and gather them back into a deck. So a pass is a deal and gather back into a deck. So with those variables, the main thing we care about is the number of piles squared. And the reason for that is that if you remember, the number of piles squared, it gives you the maximum number of cards that you can randomize in a 2-pass algorithm. And that is generally what we're aiming for, because 2 passes tends to give the best trade-off of table space or mat size versus the number of passes it takes to do that randomization. So we might actually still care about different powers of the number of piles. So if we just look at the number of piles, that is the maximum number of cards we can randomize in one pass. If we look at the number of piles squared, that is the maximum number of cards we can randomize in two passes, and the number of piles cubed is the maximum number of cards that we can randomize in a three pass. From that, you will probably gather that the main choice you have as a user is how many piles you use versus how many passes. And this tends not to be a particularly difficult choice, because generally you're looking to have the minimum number of piles you can while still having only two passes. It's rare that you'll have few enough cards for one pass, and generally you want to avoid three passes if you can, because obviously it takes longer. There are some exceptions to that, so you might have personal preferences for just getting one row, even if that means three passes. Equally, there tends to be a trade-off around 40 to 60 cards where you might be deciding between 5 by 2 or 7 by 1, for example. Now, there is a caveat to wanting the fewest number of piles, which is generally you want to have an odd number of columns of piles. Usually that's going to be the choice between 5 and 7 piles, but it might be between 5 and 3 piles. The reason for that is that whenever we are thinking about these kind of physical location activities, we do generally do better with odd numbers, because we would tend to think of 3 as centre, left, right. We tend to think of 5 as centre, left, right, left of centre, right of centre, and then 7 as centre, left, right, right of left, left of right, left of centre, right of centre. And the only other thing for placement is if you are going to put your phone above the piles, then generally you want it above the middle pile of your odd number of columns. Okay, let's talk through the options on the shuffler screen and what they all do. Okay, so the obvious starting place is the number of cards, which is the number of cards you're looking to randomize. You can quickly count the deck, or most instruction books have the size of each deck for the game. We then look at the mat config, so this is the actual number of piles you want to use versus how many you actually have on the mat. So for each mat, using all the piles, there are presets in light grey, so 5 by 2 for this one, 7 by 3 for the bigger mat, and then the rest, or the whole lot, is commonly used configs. So if you've got a 5 by 2 mat, you're probably either going to be using all 5 by 2 or 5 by 1. If you've got the bigger mat, the 7 by 3 mat, you're probably going to use 7 by 3, but you also might want 7 by 2, 7 by 1, and you can do all the 5 by 3, 5 by 2, 5 by 1 configs as well. And I'll talk about setting custom ones in a minute. So we've picked the number of cards, we've picked which mat config we're going to try, we've clicked check settings, and it says it's good. So we randomize the deck, which leaves us with our last option, which is rows of output. So this is showing that we want 2 rows of output, so 2 there. This tends to be what I use. I find it good for not losing my place, but other testers have found they can do a full screen's worth and be okay. So we'll let you put 5 in without throwing any errors. That's how many will fit in the square. You can put more in, it just highlights in red and it stretches the screen. And having to scroll rather than clicking next is a pretty good way of losing your place. So let's look at a case where we do want to do a trade-off of piles versus passes, or at least we want to use large numbers of cards and see how we handle it. So we set the number of cards to 250 and hit check settings. Now, it's saying it's poor and 4 passes because we had it set to 5 by 1 cards. Yeah, that's not going to work with 250 cards. So let's have a look at info, which will tell us all we actually need to know to decide what to use. Now, note, you can just hit the presets and see what happens, but looking at this does tell us a bit more. So first of all, it will tell us how many mat spaces we're using given the mat config we've picked. So in the case where you only have 10, 15, 20 cards, it will tell you whether you can do it in one pass. But the main thing we care about is the next line. So it's telling us that for 250 cards, to achieve 2 passes, we want 16 or more piles. Now, that means we're not going to get away with 7x2 or 5x3 because there'll be 14 or 15 respectively. But 7x3 will give us 21, and that's enough. And for interest, with 7 piles, you can do it in 3 passes. So if you only had the small mat, that would be fine. You could do it in 3 passes. So we hit 7x3, we hit check settings again, and now it's saying it's good. You can do it in 2 passes. So fine, we would hit randomised deck and get on with it. At that point, we want to navigate through our instructions. So as said before, there is a previous and next button to take us back and forward. And the thing to note is there is a number in the top left corner of our output. So we can keep track of where we are, check if we've actually gone forward. As well as this, there are these down and up arrows. So these allow us to move the output screen up to the top of the screen. So useful if you have a very small phone. And that just brings you back up, and with that you can just navigate your way through all the instructions. And finally there are an extra set of instructions and settings, and you get them with the extra settings and instruction button, which takes us down. So here you can set the number of piles you want manually. So if you want to try even numbers or extra rows or whatever, and I encourage you to give it a try with a bit of cardboard and a pen, as I've said. The presets I found to be what generally work the best. As well as that, there is a recap of the instructions and an up button to take you back. If you do want to try the settings, just change it, go back up, hit check settings and see what it does. So that is how we set and use all the options on the shuffler page. There is a desktop version of the page which is the same, it's just formatted slightly differently. In terms of the current feature set, I strongly appreciate feedback. So I know there are a large number of different devices that people have and will use it on. I can only test it on a limited set at this point. As well as that, feature suggestions are greatly appreciated. I plan to continue developing this, so feature suggestions will feed into what gets developed next, crowdfunding goals, that kind of thing. So how do I use Soft Shuffle? In this section, I'm going to go through how and when I use Soft Shuffle and when I don't. Because as I've been quite clear, I'm not trying to gatekeep how people randomise their cards, whether they shuffle them or use Soft Shuffle. It's just an attempt to make there be an additional option for when it's difficult to physically shuffle cards. So I'm going to split this up into 3 different sections. So first I'm going to talk about some games and situations when I always use Soft Shuffle. Then I'm going to talk about some where it's more of a trade-off or more of a judgment call, and when I use them a bit maybe, or I use them occasionally. And then I'm going to talk about the times when I just don't use Soft Shuffle because I don't always use Soft Shuffle. So when do I always use Soft Shuffle? Well, I'm going to start off with the example I used in the intro. So popular cat-based polyomino game, but this is also a proxy for deck-driven games generally. So games where you have a often quite large deck that is the primary driver of the state of the game. So in this example, there are 150 cards and it is a constructed deck. So I will pretty much always use Soft Shuffle. So having a larger deck, it does take a bit longer to shuffle the cards, but my experience is that the rest of the setup done by someone else takes about the same time as it takes me to randomise the cards, so it doesn't slow down the game or anything. And for this I would generally use the big 21 pile mat. The choice is usually between 7x2 or 5x3 for the number of mat spaces you use. My personal preference is 5x3, but 7x2 does work quite well as well. And I tend to use 2 rows of instructions. I pretty much always use 2 rows of instructions because I tend to get lost quite easily if I don't. So I have had other testers who can just do a whole page and never get lost, but it doesn't work for me. Alright, so as well as that, I also have been this year, as part of developing Soft Shuffle, I've been working my way through an adventure game in a box, you know, the style which has both a combat and diplomacy deck of quite small, that is quite small, so I think they start off at 15, and most of the campaign mine were about 15, 16, 17. I think they got up to 20 at one point. And I find it very good for that as well, because it's very quick to randomise a 20 card deck. I mean, you can do it every turn, which you quite often need to for this game. And I use 5x1. That works pretty well. The interesting thing I found about testing it with this is I played through the entire box, so the entire first campaign, without sleeving the cards. So these aren't actually the cards, it's just the same number of cards. And I didn't sleeve the cards, which for me is a new thing. I was interested to see what the wear was like on a deck of cards that I was constantly re-randomising. So I would normally have to riffle that quite a few times, and if you're using it every turn, you're really hammering those cards. And it was interesting because of how little wear I found on the cards, because I was just dealing them out. So that worked pretty well. And the other example I would use is weird shaped cards. So mostly by this I mean small cards. So you know the ones I mean, the teeny tiny cards. I can't riffle them at all in any way. I know some people can, but I just can't. And I've tried sleeving them and mashing them, and it just about works, but they're a pain. And for some reason, square cards I find quite difficult to shuffle as well. So pretty much anything that's not a standard size card I find easier to use Soft Shuffle with. Now let's look at when it's more of a judgment call. So the primary type of games in this are CCGs, TCGs. So 40, 60, 100 card decks, they work fine with the small mat, so I only ever really used the small mat pretty much for any of the games I'm going to talk about here. I will more or less always randomise the deck before the game. So I want to start a game with a deck I am sure has been fully randomised, especially if I constructed the deck before the game. The problem tends to come when you have the type of deck where you have cycling abilities, deck searching abilities, that kind of things, and you might have to re-randomise the deck mid-game, and you don't really want to stop the game to do that. So I will generally do my best with a few riffles and a few mashes and a few overhands and see how good I can get with the time I've got. It generally doesn't feel worth stopping the game. I mean, if my opponent wanted me to, I would. If I've looked through the entire deck, for example, they might ask me to. The next type would be slightly more casual games. So this is a pirate card game that our group pretty much always plays as an end of night game, and it lasts 10 minutes. And Despite the fact that we do basically always end up cycling the decks multiple times, I won't generally use soft shuffle for this. I don't think it's worth it, basically. It's a 10-minute game, we get the deck out and we play it. What I will do quite often is re-randomising it using soft shuffle before I put it in my bag, before I take it off and go to a games night. And that kind of takes me to, again, the adventure game from the previous section. So I will almost always, with soft shuffle, randomise a new game when I get it. So it's very nice, I find, the first time you play a game to pull it off the shelf and be like, I don't have to shuffle the cards, I know I've already done it. And quite often, especially with Kickstarters and the like, I'll be sleeving the game when I first get it and unpack it and punch it. And at that point, I know how many cards there are, so I just quickly randomise it with soft shuffle and I'm done. But then later on, I will see how I feel about a particular game, whether it's a quick game that I don't feel needs it all that often, or a more in-depth game where I might choose to do it every time. And that leaves when I don't use it. So the obvious answer to this is party games. So it's not really worth it for party games. And I was trying to work out how I would define party games for this discussion. And I think it would be any game where the enjoyment is not connected to how well randomized the cards are. So the example I would give is any charades-y type game. So you draw a card and then you draw the card or act out the card or make noises for the card. It doesn't matter if the cards are ordered, frankly. It's not going to change how enjoyable the game is, and you are probably playing them in an environment where the primary enjoyment from the game is not the game itself, but from what you're doing with the game. The next time I would talk about is if it's not my game. So if it's someone else's game, I'm not going to gatekeep them. I'm not going to tell them they have to use soft shuffle. It is up to them what level of randomness they are comfortable with. It is up to them how they want to treat the game, how careful they want to be with it. Yeah, I'm not going to try and make them use soft shuffle. The next example I would use is standard card deck games, and the big caveat with that is that I can riffle a 52 card deck, and I don't generally play poker or blackjack or anything with stakes, let's say. If I did, I might use it. I might want that level of randomness, but I don't, so I don't. And with that, I will leave you with a few bonuses. So tile-based games. So I don't use it for tile-based games, but I've tried it and it works. The reason I don't use it is I quite enjoy the tactile sensation of swishing tiles around, and also you tend to swish them around and make a pile and just grab one at random as well, and that does for me for those kind of games. But when I do use it, that's a bit more random, is there are quite often situations where I will have 5 things and I need to draw 2, for example, and I'll set it to 5 by 1, and I just, whatever the first 2 that come out from soft shuffle, I'll use that as a way of picking a subset from things. And that actually happens quite often with board games, and it can be quite difficult to not have some idea of the order of those things. So when you're doing initial setup and you want to put one over there and one over there and a third one over here, and there's only 5 of them, having something which will just actually properly randomly say, well, the first one that I'm putting over there is this, the second one is that. Yeah, and that's about it. So that's when I do, when I sometimes, and when I don't use soft shuffle. So that gives you a good idea of how you can use soft shuffle, what features there are at the moment, and how, when, and why I use soft shuffle and when I don't. If you have any questions or feedback, please comment on the video, reach out on social media or on the website, and for now, randomise some cards and go play some board games.